On the hill between the neighboring villages of Gushchular and Malibeyli, I saw a large searchlight flashing. From the other side, on the summit of Mount Nurajek, it seemed as though a similar searchlight was responding. Another was signaling from the village of Mehdikent. When the three searchlights flashed at the same time, I felt as if they were signaling that we were ready. It was 11 p.m. I put the children to bed without telling them anything so they wouldn't be afraid. Half an hour later, suddenly it was as if thunder struck, as if the house lifted into the air and then fell back down again. Salam alaikum, this is Fin. February 26th is approaching, the 34th anniversary of the Khojaly tragedy, one of the 3 dates in the symbolic ritual calendar of Azerbaijanis, alongside January 20th, the day of remembrance of the victims of Black January, and March 31st, the day of genocide of Azerbaijanis. Also partially recognized as genocide, the Khojaly massacre has become one of the cornerstones of Azerbaijan's historical memory and memory politics. So much so that amid attempts at reconciliation after the 30-year conflict, the mere mention of that February night erases all good intentions. Yetti. After a 2-hour artillery bombardment by military equipment of this 366th Motor Rifle Regiment beginning at 11 p.m. on February 25th, the city, surrounded on 3 sides, was subjected to destruction and assault for 3 hours. The city's defense, consisting of 160 armed Azerbaijanis, was broken within that time. Part of the civilian population was killed. Up to 300 people hiding in basements were taken later captive. They were joined by nearly 1,000 more out of 3,000 who had been in the city on the eve of the assault and who fled during the attack into snow and sub-zero temperatures, hoping for salvation. Running toward Agdam, toward Azerbaijani posts, they couldn't have imagined what awaited them. The horrific images etched into the consciousness of every Azerbaijani and later broadcast worldwide captured hundreds of bodies, mostly elderly people, women and children, by the morning of February 26. In conditions of visibility, fire was deliberately and indiscriminately directed at the fleeing crowd, later noted in the reports by Human Rights Watch and the Russian organization Memorial. That is, fire was opened despite the ability to distinguish unarmed civilians, but even that was not. On the other side, the freezing mountain weather caused severe frostable to the lightly dressed people. They were acts of barbarity of armed individuals who scalped victims and mutilated bodies. If hell existed that day, that was on the road from Khojaly to Agdam, the road of death, where they were shot and taken prisoner. Each stop along the way, the villages of Ketuk, Nakhchivanik, Shellik, Gulabli, Garagaya, became another circle of hell. The last of these, Garagaya, became known among locals as Kanligaya, Bloody Rock. The survivors scattered. Some managed to reach Agdam, others, mostly women and children, froze to death in the mountains. There is testimony from released captives that some of those taken prisoner were executed. According to official Azerbaijan data, that night 613 people, including 63 children, 106 women and 70 elderly, never reached longed for Agdam. The fate of every 10th captive remains unknown to this day. 8 families were completely wiped out. 25 children lost both parents, 130 lost one parent. The official Azerbaijan version defines the events in Khojaly as the mass killing of civilians, a deliberate act against the civilian population, with full responsibility placed on the Armenian side. To this day, numerous versions of that happened exist, as well as conspiracy theories. Among them are claims of criminal negligence and incompetence by certain military and administrative leaders, as well as careless and ill-considered policy by the republic's leadership. Another version points to the hand of Moscow, allegedly seeking to punish Azerbaijan for distancing itself, particularly for its reluctance to join the CIS and its joint armed forces. In a detailed article written several months later, linked in the description, Arif Yunusov cites the then Turkish foreign minister, who linked the tragedy to certain circles' unwillingness to allow closer ties between Turkey and Azerbaijan. The former head of state, who adhered to his version after his forced resignation, blamed the opposition for what happened, thereby deflecting responsibility from both Moscow and the Armenians, something that latter naturally exploited. Years later, he stated that his words had been distorted and that he meant the opposition had exploited the tragedy politically rather than organized it. Nevertheless, after the publication of international reports and the emergence of video footage calling it Azerbaijani propaganda and fake footage became impossible. There is also the argument that casualties might have been fewer with early evacuation of civilians. One may assume that, knowing of the Armenian advance, the Azerbaijan leadership equated evacuation with surrender. A deserted city is extremely difficult to defend. This was compounded by internal political struggle in Baku. Notably, President Mutalibov resigned shortly after footage from Khojaly was shown in parliament, intensifying the political crisis. It remains unclear why the planned operation to unblock Khojaly was postponed on the eve of the tragedy, whether due to military incompetence or deliberate action. One can also add the general chaos of the Soviet collapse. Its legacy included the motor rifle regiment of the CIS joint forces, which participated in the operation against civilians. It was later redeployed to Georgia and disbanded 2 weeks later. The Armenian side argued that capturing Khojaly was strategically necessary and that civilian casualties resulted from chaotic combat and the presence of armed Azerbaijanis among fleeing civilians. The atrocities, according to this version, were acts of revenge by individuals for the pogroms in Sumgayit and Baku several years earlier. Another version with Armenian circle suggested provoking an Azerbaijani retaliatory action to make coexistence between Armenians and Azerbaijanis impossible within one state, particularly for Karabakh Armenians, and to accelerate separation. The Armenian side continues to insist that a humanitarian corridor existed, although even if it did, it's difficult to call a road leading from a city besieged by the Armenian forces directly towards Armenian positions as a corridor. Initially, Armenian authorities denied responsibility. This was possible amid the information blockade and political crisis in Baku. At one point, Armenia's foreign ministry distorted the findings of human rights reports. In response, in a 1997 letter to the Armenian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Human Rights Watch reaffirmed primary responsibility for most civilian deaths lay with Karabakh Armenian forces and found no evidence that Azerbaijani forces had fired upon fleeing civilians. The identities of those who gave the order for the assault remain debated. However, given that the leadership of the self-proclaimed Nagorno-Karabakh Republic claimed full control over the situation in the region, logical responsibility follows. 34 years later, in court in Baku, former leaders of the separatist regime sentenced to lengthy prison terms would name figures such as Artur Mkhtchan, military commander Arkady Tertedavesyan, head of the so-called self-defense forces, who didn't deny the involvement of Karabakh Armenians in the crime against humanity. One should also mention Seyran Ohanyan, in 1992 a major of the 2nd Battalion formed from Armenian servicemen of the ill-fated regiment, later Armenia's Minister of Defense. This battalion was the main force during the assault. The actions committed by Armenian armed formations in Khojaly grossly violated international conventions. The massacre was included in the encyclopedia Atrocities, Massacres and War Crimes. It occupies a special place in the more than 30-year Karabakh conflict. The mass killings and barbarity of that night became a powerful trigger of resentment and hostility. Although it is often mentioned and compared with the 1988 Sumgayit pogroms against Armenians, it is important to distinguish between a pogrom and a war crime committed during armed conflict. The scale is entirely different. Comparing them is immoral and inappropriate. The place of Khojaly in Azerbaijan's memory is so significant that even after victory in the 2020 Karabakh War, when Khojaly itself was still not under Baku's control, this remained a kind of fly in the ointment. Today, as descendants of displaced persons begin returning, Khojaly remains a symbol of pain and unwillingness to reconcile. Memory politics has played a significant role here, as the state consciously shapes a historical narrative that continues to influence public consciousness. Khojaly has become, in Pierre Nora's words, a site of memory, a symbolic point where collective memory is concentrated. International recognition of the tragedy has become part of Azerbaijan's foreign policy. A number of countries and organizations have recognized the Khojaly massacre as genocide or a crime against humanity. However, in countries with strong Armenian diasporas, such initiatives have faced resistance, as in the controversy surrounding the monument to the victims in Mexico City, where after lengthy debate, the square was renamed. Every war eventually ends in peace. Former enemies may become not only friendly neighbors but even allies. This usually requires political will to move forward, partial acknowledgement of responsibility, economic integration, and the creation of joint commissions. Yet almost always the sides cannot reach full agreement in evaluating history and mutually recognizing crimes. Signing a peace treaty alone doesn't guarantee genuine reconciliation. It is possible only through acknowledgement of mistakes, expression of regret, and readiness for honest dialogue. History knows examples when symbolic gestures of reconciliation provoked protests on both sides, as in the case of Serbian leaders visiting Srebrenica. Whether such steps are possible in Armenian-Azerbaijani context remains an open question. True peace comes only after societies undertake internal work regarding their own memory and responsibility. Subscribe, like, hit the bell, leave comments, and share this video with friends. By the way, this video is also available in Russian, and remember, there is no good or bad culture. There is simply a different culture. Salamat kalın.